بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. Welcome back everyone to a new course, Crimes and Punishments Part 2, or the second part, which we will essentially just pick up where we left off, and we will begin today's class by talking about renegades, al-Bugha. Now, the issue of renegades is there is some Islamic history that is associated with understanding where these rules are coming from. Of course, there's an overarching primary text, the Quran, and some of the hadith that talk about how to deal with these type of situations. Of course, we'll begin with that. But in today's lecture, we will spend a lot of time talking about or making allusions to or references to the fitna of the early Sahaba, uh, particularly during the time of the Khilafah of Imam Ali alayhi salam, and how he dealt with those who opposed him in the Battle of the Jamal and the Battle of Siffin. We'll make references to those because it's important to understand some of the texts that we are going to read and how the Imam, the person in charge, or the Khalifa in the case of the story. But as I've mentioned before, I hope I've mentioned this. If I haven't, the word imam when it comes to this part of Islamic law simply means the person in charge, the Khalifa, the supreme, political leader of the Muslim community. So those that oppose this imam and they have a grievance, that's the key distinguishing thing between the renegade and somebody who's just a regular criminal, is that the renegades, the bugha, they have a grievance. The grievance might have legitimacy to it, or it might be an incorrect interpretation, which is usually the case, and therefore they are dealt with in a certain way versus just being someone who is a criminal. And I think that that's a fine distinction that I also want to get across in today's lecture to make sure that that is clear, is to understand that there is a grievance. And like we will show you with some of the fitna of the Sahaba, of course this is the Sunni interpretation or the dominant interpretation of that fitna. We will also make allusion to what does not constitute a legitimate grievance, because not everyone who has just an opposing view has a grievance. So, in the reading of the text of Abi Shuja and commenting on it, I will be making those type of references. So today's lecture, as the first lecture, is going to be a little bit different than some of the other ones because we'll keep jumping back and forth. And I'll begin the discussion in the next clip, inshallah. So we begin the course as we always begin, which is to turn to the text of Abi Shuja radiallahu anhu, to read the Arabic and then the translation, followed by some of the adillah. So he says, قال المصنف رحمه الله ونفعنا بعلومه في الدارين آمين فصل في قتال البغاة ويقاتل أهل البغي بثلاثة شرائط: أن يكونوا في منعة، وأن يخرجوا عن قبضة الإمام، وأن يكون لهم تأويل سائغ. That's where I'm going to read up to. I know it sounds like it's very short, but we'll see when we get into the commentary that it's not. So he says, radiallahu anhu, fighting those who rebel against the Imam is obligatory when three conditions are met: that group, meaning the renegade group, poses a true physical threat; number two, has removed themselves from obeying the Imam; and number three, possess a reasonable explanation for disobeying the Imam. Okay, let me quickly look at the adillah. The main adillah is verse number 9 from Surah Al-Hujurat. وَإِن طَائِفَتَيْنِ مِنَ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ اقْتَتَلُوا فَأَصْلِحْ بَيْنَهُمَا فإن بغت إحداهما على الأخرى فقاتلوا التي تبغي حتى تفيء إلى أمر الله فإن فاءت فأصلحوا بينهما بالعدل وأقسطوا إن الله يحب المقسطين. So وإن طائفتان, if there are two groups, من المؤمنين, from the believers. So now this is a dispute within the family of Islam. And that's why there's a special section in Islamic law dealing with them, because we're not talking about the enemy or the non-Muslim, or we're not talking about a neighboring, empire or kingdom or something like that, or nation. We're talking about our own selves, our own people. وَإِن طَائِفَتَانِ, if two groups, مِنَ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ, from the believers, fight, so try to reconcile between them. Obviously, we'll talk about the reconciliation. فَإِن بَغَتْ, if one of them is excess over the other, then you are commanded to fight the one who has aggressed until they stop. and then you reconcile between them. So that's the main verse. Of course, this verse is general, okay, and a lot of the fiqh that we're going to talk about in this lecture and in tomorrow's lecture, where we will wrap up the renegade section, will be specific. So sometimes the adillah is general and not specifics. And I've told you multiple times my philosophy of, even though it's an introductory course or slash intro slash medium course, I think it's always important to mention the adillah so one's ears get used to hearing them associated. Another important hadith that comes from Muslim, the collection of Muslim, من أتاكم وأمركم جميع على رجل واحد. If somebody comes to you to aggress against you and you are on one opinion, literally you are on on the command of one person, meaning that you are all one nation, you're one cohesive unit. يريد أن يشق عصاكم, and then this person seeks to divide you. فاقتلوا, then fight that person. This is another important adillah that comes from Muslim, because here we are now going to talk about social cohesion, unity, national unity, and those type of considerations. And the problem, I think, with understanding this for modern people, especially that are going to converse in the English language, is that people are going to say, well, what if the person in charge is bad? Well, what if there is corruption? So, that's something that we're going to talk about. But here we're just laying out the adillah. I think those are the two main things, just that verse and that hadith in Sahih Muslim. Okay. Of course, there are many hadith about the Khawarij, but that's not what we're going to talk about necessarily head on, because we're here to talk about the renegades. Okay, now let's go back to the beginning, inshallah, and let's go through this kind of line by line together. Now, he says, rahimahullah, fighting those who rebel against the Imam is obligatory. So the first thing I want to do is let's talk a little bit about what the Imam means, because that's important. Having an Imam, what we commonly refer to as Muslims as a Khalifa, is an obligation, and this comes, ironically, it comes from the books of Aqidah, and he quotes, Al-Bajuri quotes the Jawhara, وَوَاجِبُ النَّصْبُ إِمَامٍ عَدْلِ بِالشَّرْعِ فَعْلَمْ لَا بِحُكْمِ الْعَقْلِ. It's obligatory to have an Imam, to appoint an Imam, meaning a Khalifa, and this obligation comes from the Sharia. It's not necessarily a rational thing. And the reason why the discussion of the Khalifa is typically found in the books of Aqidah is because of the early fitna that happened between the Sahaba. And therefore it became a type of theological discussion, i.e. a theological discussion between the Sunnis and the Shia, or the Sunnis articulating their position against maybe some of the accusations that might come from the Shia or something like that. So ironically, you find the discussions there, even though it's a legal function, you find it in those type of books. So let me just talk very little bit about that, maybe just the remainder of this clip. What is the Imam? The Imam is for us considered the supreme al-imama al-uzma. It is the supreme command over the affairs of the Muslims, both externally and internally as well. So there is some overlap between the Sunni belief and the Shia belief of the spiritual component. Not so much. The overlap is just a little bit, because I think by spiritual leadership, the Shia interpretation will be quite different. But one of the conditions of the Imam in the Sunni understanding is that the Imam has to be mujtahid. So there is that understanding that the Imam has to have that deep understanding of the religion itself. So usually there's an appointment. How is the Imam appointed? How is the Khalifa appointed? He is appointed, meaning that's one of the conditions, it has to be a man, is that he is appointed by the agreement of those who loosen and bind. Ahlul Halli wal Aqd. Ahlul Halli wal Aqd is a technical term that refers to the mujtahid amongst the fuqaha and those senior people in society or leaders of components of society that are central, like commander, like like a general of the army, or the head of the police force, or something like that. The head of, I don't know, major figures in society. Of course, in the modern world, we have a different structure of society. So I'm just trying to find things that are kind of that overlap. But anyway, those are included also in the group of the people that bind and loosen, ahlul halli wal aqd. But the primary or the traditional understanding is that they are the mujtahids amongst the fuqaha, and therefore there will always be few. If the majority of them agree that so and so is the khalifa, then so and so is the khalifa. And if those people get together and say this guy messed up, and they have to depose the Khalifa, then they have the power to depose the Khalifa. Or the current Khalifa left instructions that so and so will take, over after me, and then that person has been legitimized by that group of people, Ahlul Hali wal Aqd. Or a third way is that somebody takes it by force, and unfortunately, that's kind of usually what happens historically. In the historical record, is that people just take it by force, and that's where you can have somebody who is illegitimate from the point of view of the Sharia. That person doesn't fulfill the conditions, but it's an obligation to follow that person because civil strife, al-fitnatu ashaddu min al-qatl, Allah says that civil strife is worse than fighting. So that's how, in the Sunni understanding of statecraft, you can find somebody at the top who is legitimate from the point of view that we owe that person allegiance, and we have to follow the rule of law as best as we can, even if that person is tyrannical or despotic, etc., and be patient with that. And then that person's hisab is with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or their usurping of powers with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So those are kind of three broad ways about how a khalifa comes. Either Ahlul Halli wal Aqd appoint them straight out, or the current khalifa leaves instructions that there's somebody who's going to be behind after me, or a group of people you can choose from these 3, 4, 5, 6 people after me, and then they are confirmed through that committee of Ahlul Halli wal Aqd. Or, which usually has happened historically, is that power is just usurped, because that's the nature of power. The nature of power is that it's going to have some kind of violence associated with it. So that imam becomes the legitimate imam from the point of view of we have to follow that person. They might be a corrupt person, and that corruption is between them and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But their personal corruption does not negate the obligation of following the rule of law. And that's kind of where I think a lot of modern people have a kind of difficulty wrapping their heads around that. Okay, let me pick up the discussion in the next clip, inshallah. Okay, so that's a little bit about the imam. Of course, there might be questions about that. When the time comes, we can talk about that. This is not a class on Islamic governance. We actually will have a course later in the curriculum for that. Perhaps it's best to kind of elongate what I just said there, but for the purposes of the current discussion, I just wanted to mention it. Okay, so he says, rahimahullah, fighting those who rebel against the imam is obligatory. So now we know a little bit about the imam, and therefore we know that the khalifa, and I'm sorry that there's two words, but in this case they're just interchangeable. But the imam, following the imam is an obligation. It's haram, actually it's considered a major sin, to rebel. So this is, again, just to repeat what I said at the end of the last clip, is that this is something that you're going to have to learn to wrap your head around, that the Sharia understands that there can be a situation where the ruler can be bad, but we still have to obey that ruler. And that's the dichotomy that sometimes, well, if he's bad, why should we have to follow them? Because not following him could lead to a harm that far outweighs the harm of that person, that individual person's situation. There are mechanisms to depose the ruler. As I mentioned, the group Ahlul Halli wal Aqd have the power to do that, but they're going to have to go through certain motions, and again, the details of that will be found when we talk about statecraft. So the fact that there's an imam or any ruler, duly constituted in the sense that they are recognized as the ruler, even if they took the power by force, then we as citizens, or in their kind of under their care, have the obligation to follow as best as we can the rule of law. And then therefore if somebody rebels, that's the section of fiqh that we're talking about. So it becomes an obligation for the imam to fight those persons, because it will lead to civil strife. You can't just have people that just sort of don't like something and they just renege and rebel against the state. That becomes highly problematic. And then he says, um, fighting those who rebel against the Imam is obligatory when three conditions are met. Three conditions are met. Okay, so let's look at that. The first condition, that he says is that they pose a true physical threat. Now, there can be a group of people or a minority group of people that are in opposition, but if they do not possess a physical threat to safety, to public safety, then they're not going to be considered a renegade. They're just going to be considered criminals or protesters or something. So we'll deal with them in another way, in a less kind of a less direct way. Sometimes you might even ignore them. The Khalifa might just decide to ignore them because they're just insignificant, and I don't want to give oxygen to that. Or maybe it's a police problem where they'll be like arrested, for public disturbance or something like that. So here, the first condition is that we're talking about an armed group of people, people who are armed, and therefore there is the potential for massive casualties or loss of property, so on and so forth. There is a threat to the public good, and the threat of violence against the public good. Okay, that's what he means. And yakunu fi menatin. And in the commentary he says بأن يكون لهم شوكة. And shauka is an important word that you understand when you talk about statecraft, because shauka means that they have force, they have power, that they have weapons, that they have the ability to cause and inflict harm. And therefore, the Imam has the obligation, therefore, as part of the job of the Imam, is to protect the rest of the community against that. Now, in that condition, it is not a condition that they be organized to the point that they have a leader. So that's also another detail that's important to mention. There could just be a group of people, or there could be a city that has rebelled, or a governance that has rebelled, or a district that has rebelled, or a state that has rebelled. I'm just trying to use different words so you kind of get my point. But they still haven't coalesced into like an entire, or gelled into an entire opposition, and formed their own country or a pseudo country or something like. It doesn't have to get to that level. They don't even have to have a leader. Just like the example that the fuqaha use is the battle of the Jamal, that when Sayyidina Ali alayhi salam went to fight, they did not, those other people in the battle of Al-Jamal, they did not have an imam, a counter imam. They just had a grievance, and they just had a problem, but they possessed, they were a threat. They were a potential threat because they had arms and whatnot. So it is not a condition that the opposition be organized to that point. Okay. And then number two, they have removed themselves from obeying the imam. So there is that is the act of rebellion. They've maybe refused to pay taxes, or they've refused to comply to some kind of law, or there's a battle, a national battle that the imam has called to arms, and each district has to provide resources or men or soldiers, and these people are refusing. So there is this act of refusal, the act of refusing to comply to something. So it's not just people bad mouthing the imam. It's not just people that are criticizing policy or something like that. We're not talking about that. We're talking about armed rebellion. So there's the organized, or not necessarily organized, as we said, but there is the potential threat. So they have power, some kind of power to enact violence against the state, and there is that physical act of rebellion. They have refused to comply. They have refused to do something. So that's also important. And then third, which is I think one of the most significant ones, which we'll probably spend the rest of the time talking about, is they possess a reasonable explanation for disobeying the imam. So just to get it out of the way, if they have an unreasonable explanation, they are not treated as al-bugha. So some of the things that will come later in the chapter will not apply to them. So if somebody, like there are some of the Arabs that left Islam after the passing of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and they said we only follow a prophet who's alive because if a prophet dies, his religion dies with him or something like that. I mean that is not a potential argument. That's just an excuse. So those people are not treated like bugha. They're treated like al-murtad or something else. So here there has to be a legitimate grievance. Now obviously, when I say legitimate grievance, it doesn't necessarily mean that they are right. It just means that there's an argument to be made. There's an argument that they have. And this is exactly where we can invoke the fitna that happened between Sayyidina Muawiyah radiallahu anhu and Imam Ali alayhi salam. And even in the Sunni understanding, we believe that actually it's a point of almost consensus. I think in the Hashiyah, Al-Bayjuri says it's a point of consensus that Imam Ali was right. So there's no Sunni tradition that Muawiyah was right and Imam Ali was wrong. Our difference between the Shia is in laying the blame. Who do we lay the blame on? Which is something that I don't want to get into in this lecture because I don't think it's appropriate. But the point is that after Sayyidina Uthman, when he was the Khalifa radiallahu anhu, was assassinated, Muawiyah and his people, Muawiyah was the then governor of Damascus, he was calling for the Imam Ali as the Khalifa to arrest and to execute and to bring to justice those people that killed the Sayyidina Uthman radiallahu anhu. Imam Ali's tafsir was a little bit different. He said, yes, we need to do that, but we need to, we have a foreign element that is infiltrated, because Sayyidina Umar was assassinated, then Sayyidina Uthman was assassinated radiallahu anhuma. We need to bring the national security situation under control, and then we will find the perpetrators of this crime and bring them to justice. In that, you can say that Sayyidina Muawiyah radiallahu anhu had an opinion. There was a cause for him to do what he did. And I'll pick this up inshallah in the next clip. So at the end of the last clip, we're talking a little bit about the fitna that happened between Sayyidina Muawiyah radiallahu anhu and Imam Ali alayhi salam. And that Muawiyah was asking for those who killed Sayyidina Uthman radiallahu anhu, who was his clansmen, Bani Umayyah, to justice. And there was even some people underneath Sayyidina Muawiyah that accused Imam Ali of withholding those people. And Imam Ali said, well, I didn't kill him. I didn't have anything to do with it. If I knew where they were, we would hand them over. But right now we got to take care of this nonsense of national security as a national security issue. So in that regard, the side of Sayyidina Muawiyah, even though they were wrong, or history ended up proving them wrong, or even at that time they were proved to be wrong, and there are even hadith that allude to the fact that these are the people that aggressed and they are wrong, as foretold by the Prophet ﷺ, there was a reason. What does he say in the translation? There was a reasonable explanation. It was a reasonable ask that Muawiyah and his people would say, we want the killers of Sayyidina Uthman radiallahu anhu to be brought to justice. It's very hard to say that's a reasonable thing. Whether they meant it, that's where there's going to be a difference between Sunni and Shia interpretations, and we're not here to adjudicate that. I mean, well, then they were Sunni, so we don't believe in that side we don't believe in that aspect, or that aspect of interpreting the story. But on face value, prima facie, it's a legitimate grievance. So therefore, these people now have rebelled. This is where they're armed. As a matter of fact, in some of the narrations, the side of Muawiyah, there were more people than the side of Imam Ali alayhi salam, but Imam Ali was given victory. And the Prophet said, Al-haqqu ma Ali ayyama dar. The truth is with Ali wherever he goes, alayhi salam. And there are other hadith that we understand to indicate that his tafsir was correct and Muawiyah's tafsir was wrong. It's just as simple as that. Now, what does the Imam do in that situation where there's an armed resistance? So there's a potential for violence. There is the act of rebellion, the refusal to, in this case, Muawiyah refused to give the bay'ah or to coalesce, behind Imam Ali and continue with the affairs of the ummah, of the state. And then there is the grievance that is a reasonable grievance. So in this case, the Imam needs to send a negotiator, needs to send somebody to discuss and to parley with the other side, which is exactly what Imam Ali did. He sent multiple people to the side of Muawiyah. He even sent people to the Khawarij. I mean, he sent different people to try to understand what the problem is. If those grievances are laid out, and if the grievances can be rectified, then the negotiator or the deputy of the Imam or the deputy goes back to the Imam. Then they try to alleviate the problem. They try to remove whatever that grievance is, or rectify it, or address it, or kind of assuage their feelings or something like that. So there is a type of negotiation. So if the Imam or the Imam's deputy voices hears about the grievance and takes measures to solve the grievance, and the other side is still in a state of rebellion, then there is like a last warning, and then there is the announcement that we are going to fight. And these type of things that we're talking about, if you look at any nation's civil war, which are unfortunately amongst the bloodiest of conflicts, civil wars tend to be the bloodiest conflicts. May Allah Ta'ala protect us. You will see something like this has happened, where there's an opposition, the opposition starts to coalesce against a cause, they are armed, then they are therefore in a state of rebellion because they are rejecting, what the dominant side or the original side has asked to be done. They are rejecting that. Then before the actual act of war, there usually is some type of parley negotiation that takes place. It's not just people go straight to violence. And that's also the mark of the rebellion, that the rebellion does not necessarily have to be violent. I mean, the way that we're discussing it in the books of fiqh, there are many opportunities for it not to be violent. So the negotiator, that's a critical component. There has to be some type of dialogue. Some people don't want a dialogue. If they don't dialogue, then the Imam has the right just to go and to start to fight, to bring them by force to the whole again, because that's the obligation of the Imam, to keep the whole. You can't just have people just when they don't like something they renege. But if the grievances can be heard, and if the grievances are found not to be ridiculous, so if somebody said, I said in the beginning of this clip, that if the grievance, or maybe it was in the last clip, if the grievance is not reasonable by definition, like the people that don't believe left Islam after the Prophet ﷺ passed away, then there's no negotiating in that case. You have to stop the threat of violence. But if in the case of Muawiyah radiallahu anhu and Imam Ali alayhi salam, it was a reasonable thing to ask, and therefore Imam Ali tried to address it, and what happened, and it wasn't, the outcome was very unfortunate. I'm just trying to see what else I want to share with you all. Okay, I'm going to go back now because I don't want to go further in the text. I want to go back to the top of the chapter. The one thing about the Imam, when we talked a little bit about the Imam, it is not a condition to obey the Imam that the Imam be just. So that's the sentence that I wanted to get across that I think I kind of glossed over. So we hope that the Imam is Aidil. We hope that the Khalifa is just, or the person in charge is just. But that person being just is not a condition for us obeying. And that's the Sunni position that I think a lot of times people criticize, or people don't understand, or a lot of Sunni Muslims, some, let's say some, not all, not a lot, some Sunni Muslims reject. But that's something that's very important for you to wrap your head around. So Islam is a very realistic system of law. And when it comes to statecraft, it's very, very real. It's very, very pragmatic. So again, the Imam being just is being unjust does not negate our obedience. So a renegade group cannot justify their rebellion by saying that the Imam is unjust. That's what I'm trying to say. There might be grievances, there might be specific issues that hopefully can be rectified, which would enter them into this part of Islamic law. So there's a space for that. Not that we're advocating for rebellion, that's very, very dangerous stuff. But the reason the rebels or the renegades are in the wrong is because they have rebelled against the direction of the state that's being led by the Imam. So one cannot retort and say, well, the Imam is unjust. That's not acceptable. That's not an acceptable. That's between him and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And in that way, Islam allows us to live under different types of situations. I mean, there's always going to be injustice, and there's always inefficient government, and I mean that's any type of government is like that. It's just the nature of the nature of the entity itself. So one has to be very careful in this regard. And for those that try to justify their rebellion, they also have to be very careful that it doesn't come down to, oh, this person is a fasiq, or this person is a this, or this person is a that, because those things are very dangerous to levy against a person. Okay. Yes, when the Imam is dealing with the rebels, whether directly or with a negotiator or a deputy or something like that, this has to be an internal affair. So unless it's an extreme situation, the Imam can't outsource that type of negotiating to a third party or to a non-Muslim state actor. But this is a Muslim-Muslim conflict, and it has to be dealt with in the way that we have laid out in the basic fiqh, in a Muslim way. It's our problem, our family problem, so we have to deal with it ourselves. Okay, in tomorrow's lecture, we'll jump further and talk about what happens post the conflict, inshallah. But for right now, we'll leave a pin here. Wallahu ta'ala a'la wa a'lam wa sallallahu ala sayyidina mawlana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Okay, so in today's class, we just began this section, this new course, and then the section talking about the renegades, the bugha. And because there are some references to some historical events, I went a little bit slower than usual. So we talked about the Imam / the Khalifa, and some of the three broad ways that a Khalifa can be established. Either the Khalifa is appointed by the committee of Ahlul Hali wal Aqd, or the current Khalifa or the last Khalifa left instructions who to choose from, or, which is probably usually historically the most prevalent, is that somebody comes to power by force. And we talked about that the uprightness and justness of a leader is not a condition for us obeying that leader. And that's one of those things that's unique to Sunni statecraft, political science. And then we said that the renegades are those people who have formed a power center and therefore are an actual threat to the body politic. Number two, they have actually done the act of rebellion, so they refuse to comply or refuse to hand over, refuse to do something that's being asked of them. And number three, they have a reasonable grievance, a reasonable cause. And that's very important, because in that situation, when there's a part of the body politics that's in rebellion, the Imam will send somebody to negotiate, to hear out their grievances, to see if they can reconcile those grievances. If those grievances are reconciled, great, alhamdulillah, then they can come back to the fold. If they're not, if they don't give you any grievances, or if their grievances are ridiculous, or if you've tried to solve the grievances and they're still in a state of rebellion, then after a warning, the imam has the right to fight them, to bring them back to the union, to bring them back to the body politic at whole. And those are the main topics we talked about. And to kind of mirror this, we looked a little bit about the fitna between Sayyidina Muawiyah radiallahu anhu and Imam Ali alayhi salam. Even though we believe Imam Ali was correct, we talked a little bit about how he tried to negotiate with him, and how Muawiyah had a reasonable cause, which is he wanted brought to justice the murders of Sayyidina Uthman radiallahu anhu. But Imam Ali didn't reject that, but he had another pressing matter, which was national security. So we talked a little bit about that, and then and some smaller tidbits. But those are the main topics. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen.